The air inside the Austin Convention Center was electric, a tangible thing humming with the frequency of power and ambition. It smelled of expensive perfume, aged whiskey, and the crisp, cold currency of new ideas that were changing the world from this very city, the sprawling tech metropolis they called Silicon Hills. On this particular evening, the annual Texas Innovation Gala had drawn the state's brightest minds, a constellation of venture capitalists, programming prodigies, and corporate titans, all gathered under the soft, forgiving glow of colossal crystal chandeliers. At the center of this glittering universe, holding court without even trying, was Caleb Vance. At 35, he wasn't just a player in the world of artificial intelligence, he was the architect of its new kingdom. His company, Aura Intelligence, was more than a success story, it was a phenomenon, and tonight, everyone knew the grand prize, the Innovator of the Year award, had his name etched on it before the presenter even opened the envelope. From her seat at the head table, Dr. Aris Thorne watched her husband. To everyone else, he was Caleb Vance, the visionary. To her, he was just Caleb. The man who still left his coffee mug on the edge of the marble countertop, who had a laugh that started in his chest and took over his whole body, who could untangle the most complex ethical quandaries of her work in bioethics with a clarity that still surprised her. She rested a hand on the gentle, firm curve of her stomach, a silent conversation with the new life that was just beginning to make its presence known. Their life, the one they had so carefully constructed, felt like this room, vast, beautiful, and filled with limitless potential. Aris, a respected academic in her own right, was never one for the hollow glamour of these events, but tonight was different. Tonight was a coronation, the culmination of a decade of sleepless nights and relentless belief. It was the summit of a mountain they had climbed together. When the announcement came, a wave of thunderous applause swept through the hall. Caleb rose, smoothing the lapels of his custom Tom Ford suit. He leaned down and gave Aris a kiss, a brief, warm pressure against her lips that tasted faintly of champagne. "For us," he whispered, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. She squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with a pride so profound it almost hurt. She watched him ascend the stage, moving with an easy, athletic grace that belied the immense pressure he carried. He owned the stage, just as he owned the room, just as he seemed to own the future itself. He began his speech, and his voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, was a perfect blend of humility and command. He thanked his team, calling them the true innovators. He thanked the city of Austin for giving a kid from Dallas a chance. His words were a masterclass in charisma, weaving a narrative of bootstrap ambition and collaborative genius. The audience was captivated, hanging on every syllable. Aris found herself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile that reached her eyes. This was the man she loved. The brilliant, driven, and fundamentally good man she had chosen to build a life with. But none of this, Caleb said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in even closer, would mean anything without the person who is my moral compass, my intellectual sparring partner, and my absolute rock. My incredible wife, Dr. Aris Thorne. He looked directly at her, and in that moment, the cavernous hall seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them. The warmth of 1,000 spotlights was nothing compared to the heat in his gaze. "Aris, you make everything better. This is for you." The applause that followed was even louder, a deafening roar of approval for this perfect couple, this symbol of modern success. Aris felt tears prick her eyes, tears of joy and overwhelming love. She brought a hand to her cheek, laughing softly. She was the anchor to his soaring ambition, the quiet conscience of his technological empire. She had never felt more certain of anything in her life. And then, it happened. It was a flicker. A glitch in the flawless performance. As the applause continued to wash over him, Caleb's perfect smile remained, but his eyes moved. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. For a fraction of a second, his gaze broke from the adoring sea of faces and darted towards the back of the room, to a dark, anonymous space near the service exit. It was a dead zone, a place of no significance. And then he gave a nod. It wasn't a nod of general acknowledgement to the crowd. It was specific, sharp, and clandestine. It was a gesture stripped of all performance, a private signal transmitted across a public space. Immediately, his eyes snapped back to the audience, the radiant smile locking back into place as if it had never left. The entire event, from the shift of his eyes to the nod and back again, couldn't have lasted more than a single second. To anyone else in the room, it was nothing. A stray glance. An involuntary movement. But to Aris, whose entire career was built on observing the minute details of human behavior, it was a profound dissonance. It was a note played devastatingly out of key in an otherwise perfect symphony. Her smile faltered, the joyful tears on her cheeks suddenly feeling cold. Her brain, the logical, analytical part of her, scrambled for an explanation. It was a member of his security team. A reporter he knew. An old colleague he'd spotted. But her intuition, the deep, primal part of her that was now wired to protect not just herself but the child within her, rejected every single excuse. The gesture hadn't been one of recognition. It had been one of confirmation. An acknowledgement of a shared, hidden secret. A cold dread began to seep into her veins, a chilling counterpoint to the warm pride she had felt just moments before. Who was he nodding to? She scanned the dark corner of the room, but it was just a shifting mass of shadows and silhouettes. There was no one of note, no one who warranted such a specific, secret acknowledgement from the man of the hour. The applause finally began to die down, and Caleb started to make his way off the stage, the heavy glass trophy in his hand. People were swarming him, shaking his hand, patting his back. But Aris wasn't watching him anymore. Her gaze was fixed on that empty, insignificant corner of the room, a place that now felt like the scene of a crime she had just witnessed but couldn't yet understand. The perfect evening was shattered. She didn't know how, and she didn't know why, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the man walking back towards her table was not the same man who had left it just a few minutes ago. The performance was over, and a terrifying, unknown reality was about to begin. To comprehend the collapse of a structure, one must first examine its foundation. You have to go back, past the polished marble floors and the soaring glass walls, to the bedrock upon which it was built. The story of Caleb Vance and Aris Thorne, the golden couple of Silicon Hills, was not one of inherited privilege or silver spoon fortunes. Theirs was a fortress built by hand, brick by painstaking brick, on the uneven ground of ambition and intellect. And like any fortress, it had a hidden flaw, a hairline fracture invisible to the outside world, waiting for the right seismic event to tear it all apart. Caleb Vance's story began far from the rarefied air of Austin's tech elite, in a modest, book-filled home in a Dallas suburb. His father was a high school history teacher, a man who believed that the great narratives of the world were shaped by ordinary people with extraordinary will. Caleb grew up not with stock portfolios, but with stories of Roman engineers, Renaissance inventors, and American pioneers. From his father, he didn't inherit wealth, he inherited a framework for ambition and a deep-seated belief that a single, focused mind could reshape the world. He was a restless prodigy, the kind of boy who wasn't just building computers in his garage, but was writing the code to make them think, to make them learn. His ambition wasn't just a desire to be successful, it was a furious, burning need to build a legacy that would echo his father's historical heroes. When he arrived at the University of Texas at Austin, it was with a second-hand car, a scholarship, and a laptop that contained the nascent code for what would become Aura Intelligence. Those early years were a blur of cheap ramen, cramped apartments shared with other hopefuls, and the relentless, 24-hour glow of a computer screen. He didn't just work hard, he worked with a monk-like devotion, sacrificing social circles, relationships, and sleep at the altar of his creation. Aura Intelligence wasn't just a company to him, it was the tangible manifestation of his will, proof that the history teacher's son from Dallas could build an empire more lasting than any his father had ever taught him about. And the empire rose. Aura became a titan, its predictive analytics and machine learning algorithms weaving themselves into the very fabric of modern life. Caleb, in turn, became a legend. He was the visionary on the cover of magazines, the charismatic genius who could sell a complex idea with a simple, compelling story. He built his penthouse atop the tallest residential tower in Austin, a glass fortress in the sky that offered a panoramic god's-eye view of the city he had conquered. But inside that fortress, a profound silence reigned. The parties he hosted felt like performances. The conversations he had were transactional, always circling back to valuations, acquisitions, and the next big thing. People didn't see Caleb, they saw the Aura brand. They saw a symbol, a resource, a stepping stone. And in the dead of night, after the sycophants had departed and the city lights twinkled below like a distant, indifferent galaxy, Caleb Vance would feel the crushing weight of his own isolation. He had built a world around himself, only to find he was the sole inhabitant. It was into this gilded cage that Dr. Aris Thorne walked. They met not at a lavish party, but at a sterile university auditorium during a symposium on the ethics of artificial intelligence. Aris was a panelist, a rising star in the field of bioethics whose work explored the moral labyrinth of genetic engineering and synthetic life. She was brilliant, fiercely principled, and utterly unimpressed by the cult of personality that surrounded Caleb. While others saw a king, she saw a man wielding a power he might not fully comprehend. Their first conversation was not a flirtation, it was a debate. She challenged the core assumptions of his work, questioning the long-term societal impact of Aura's algorithms. She didn't care about his net worth, she cared about his moral framework. For Caleb, it was intoxicating. For the first time in years, he wasn't being flattered or pitched, he was being seen. He was being challenged by an intellectual equal who saw past the billionaire facade to the complex, and sometimes conflicted, man beneath. Aris didn't fall in love with the legend of Caleb Vance, she fell in love with the man who would stay up until 3 a.m, sketching out ethical protocols on a whiteboard because of a question she had posed. Their marriage became a symbiotic union of relentless forward motion and deep-rooted stability. Caleb was the engine, the visionary pushing Aura into new and uncharted territories. Aris was the conscience, the anchor, the one who ensured their shared life was built on something more meaningful than share prices and public acclaim. She founded a philanthropic wing of the company, channeling Aura's vast resources into education and healthcare initiatives. She kept him grounded, reminding him of the world outside their glass tower. She filled the silence of the penthouse with laughter, with debate, with life. She gave his empire a soul. She had, he believed, finally cured him of his loneliness. But a foundation is not defined by its strongest materials, but by its weakest point. For all his success, for all the genuine love he felt for Aris, the core of Caleb's vulnerability remained. It was the deeply ingrained insecurity of the boy from Dallas, the nagging voice that whispered that all of this, the company, the wealth, the respect, could vanish in an instant. It was the fear that he was, at his core, an imposter, a history teacher's son playing dress-up in a billionaire's world. His love for Aris was real, but it was also intertwined with this fear. Her unwavering moral clarity was his anchor, but sometimes, in his darkest moments, it also felt like a judgment, a standard he feared he could never truly meet. This was the crack. This was the flaw in the bedrock. It was a quiet, dormant fault line of insecurity and a lingering taste for the kind of validation that Aris, in her principled honesty, could never provide. She offered genuine love, not blind adoration. She offered partnership, not hero worship. The fortress they built together was strong, designed to withstand any external assault. But they never considered that the greatest threat would not come from a rival company or a market crash. It would come from a single, well-placed whisper, from someone who knew exactly where to press on that invisible crack until the entire foundation began to tremble. And that person, a specialist in identifying and exploiting the hidden fractures in powerful men, was about to enter their lives. Her name was Lila Monroe. In the ecosystem of Silicon Hills, Lila Monroe was a top-tier predator. She operated not with brute force, but with a scalpel. As one of the most influential tech journalists in the country, her articles could buoy a startup into the stratosphere or send a struggling giant into a death spiral. She was known for her incisive prose and an almost supernatural ability to unearth the human story, the ambition, the fear, the ego, that pulsed beneath the sterile surface of corporate press releases. She didn't just report on the industry, she profiled its kings, and in doing so, she learned the precise architecture of their crowns, their thrones, and their insecurities. She was charming, disarmingly intelligent, and when she focused her attention on a subject, it was with the total, unnerving concentration of a sniper acquiring a target. And for months, her target had been Caleb Vance. Their first official meeting took place in the stark, minimalist expanse of Caleb's corner office on the 50th floor of the Aura Tower. The room was a testament to his aesthetic: clean lines, cold marble, and a single, panoramic wall of glass that offered a commanding view of the city below. It was a room designed to project power and control. Lila Monroe, however, was not easily intimidated. She entered not as a journalist seeking a quote, but as a peer, an equal. She didn't begin with the softball questions about quarterly earnings or product pipelines that Caleb was used to deflecting. Instead, she started with a question about his father, the history teacher. "Your father taught history," she began, her voice a calm, measured alto. "He taught narratives of great men and falling empires. Do you ever feel like you're living in one of his lessons? And if so, are you building Rome, or are you watching it burn?" The question caught Caleb off guard. It was personal, philosophical, and deeply insightful. It bypassed the CEO and spoke directly to the man, to the history teacher's son. For an hour, they didn't just conduct an interview, they engaged in a high-stakes chess match of intellect and psychology. Lila had done her homework. She had read every profile, every paper he'd co-authored in college, even his father's obituary. She didn't ask what kept him up at night, she demonstrated that she already knew. She spoke of the isolation of the visionary, the burden of being the singular point upon which thousands of livelihoods depended. She didn't flatter his success, she empathized with its immense, unseen cost. Caleb, for his part, found himself utterly disarmed. He was accustomed to a world that either revered him or envied him. He was not accustomed to a world that understood him. With Aris, he had intellectual partnership and deep, grounding love. But with Lila, he felt a different kind of connection, the intoxicating recognition of a fellow predator. She saw the world as he did, a complex system of power, ambition, and calculated risk. He left that interview feeling not just profiled, but seen, dissected, and validated in a way he hadn't realized he craved. The article she published a week later was a masterpiece, portraying him as a complex, tortured genius, a modern emperor wrestling with the weight of his creation. It was the most flattering and insightful piece ever written about him, and it was the first move in her meticulously planned infiltration. The affair did not begin with a stolen kiss or a secret tryst. It began, as so many modern betrayals do, in the cold, blue light of a screen. It started with a follow-up email from Lila, ostensibly to thank him for the interview. Buried at the end was a postscript, a single line that read, "For what it's worth, I think you're building Rome. But every emperor needs a confidant who isn't a senator." It was a coded message, an invitation into a secret alliance, and Caleb accepted. Their correspondence became his secret indulgence. It escalated from professional emails to encrypted texts, then to late-night phone calls that stretched for hours. He found himself telling her things he didn't tell Aris, not because he loved Aris any less, but because Lila operated in the same amoral, high-stakes battlefield that he did. She understood the thrill of a hostile takeover, the brutal necessity of a corporate restructuring. She didn't challenge his ethics, she sharpened his strategies. She became the mirror for the part of himself that he shielded from Aris, the ruthless, ambitious, and deeply insecure emperor. He rationalized it all with a chilling internal logic. This wasn't a betrayal of his heart, he told himself, it was a necessary compartmentalization. Aris was his life, his home, his soul. Lila was a strategic advisor. A release valve for the immense pressure he was under. He convinced himself that this secret world made him a better husband, allowing him to leave the burdens of his empire at the door and be the man Aris needed him to be. It was a sophisticated and deeply convenient lie, the kind that only a man brilliant enough to build aura intelligence could construct to deceive the one person he couldn't afford to lose. Their first physical meeting outside of a professional context was at a dark, discreet hotel bar in a part of town he rarely frequented. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and the thrill of transgression. It was there that the intellectual affair bled into the physical, a boundary crossed with an inevitability that felt both terrifying and preordained. Every subsequent meeting was a carefully planned logistical operation, a campaign of misdirection and plausible deniability. He was using the same strategic mind that ran his company to manage his own infidelity. This was the state of play on the night of the Texas Innovation Gala. His worlds, so carefully separated, were in the same room for the first time. As he stood on that stage, accepting the award, his speech about Aris being his moral compass was not a complete lie. In his twisted reality, it was the truth. She was the light, the ideal he aspired to. But in the shadows, there was Lila. She was his secret, his vice, the validation for his darker, more ambitious self. The nod he sent her way was a moment of weakness, a breach in his own meticulous protocol. It was a subconscious acknowledgement of his dual existence, a fleeting salute from the Emperor on stage to his co-conspirator in the dark. The lie he told Aris in the car on the way home was, in many ways, more significant than the affair itself. When she asked, who was the woman in the corner, the truth was still a possibility. He could have confessed. He could have begun the painful process of honesty. But instead, he chose the lie. Just a journalist, he said, the words feeling foreign and hollow in his own mouth. Her name is Lila Monroe. In that moment, he didn't just conceal his actions, he actively built a wall between himself and his wife. He chose his secret world over their shared one. He chose the lie. And for Aris, a woman whose life's work was the study of ethics and truth, that lie, so small and casually delivered, was the first concrete signal that the foundation of their life was not just cracked, but was actively being eroded from within. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was beginning to take root in the fertile ground of a husband's deceit. A seed of doubt, once planted in the fertile ground of a trusting heart, does not require much to germinate. It needs only darkness and silence, and in the days following the Texas Innovation Gala, the sprawling, sun-drenched penthouse that Aris Thorne and Caleb Vance called home had an abundance of both. The glittering trophy from that night sat on the mantelpiece in Caleb's office, a cold, glass monument to a moment that was, for Aris, now tarnished beyond recognition. The joy and pride she had felt had curdled into a low, persistent hum of anxiety, a background radiation that contaminated every interaction, every shared meal, every quiet evening. Her rational mind, the disciplined, academic part of her, tried desperately to contain it. She replayed the moment of the nod 1,000 times, dissecting it, analyzing it from every possible angle. It was nothing, it insisted. A trick of the light. A misinterpretation. A simple acknowledgement to someone in the crowd she hadn't recognized. To believe otherwise was to invite chaos into their carefully ordered world, and Aris, a woman who structured her life around logic and evidence, abhorred chaos. But her intuition, a force now amplified by the fierce, protective instincts of impending motherhood, refused to be silenced. It was a deeper, more ancient intelligence, and it told her, unequivocally, that she had witnessed a betrayal. So she began to watch. Not as a wife, but as a researcher. Her subject was her own husband. Her laboratory was their own home. She was looking for data, for patterns, for corroborating evidence that could either confirm her fears or, she prayed, dispel them entirely. At first, the changes were subtle, easily dismissed as byproducts of the immense stress Caleb was under. Aura Intelligence was in the middle of a delicate new funding round, and the pressure was immense. But the small anomalies began to accumulate, forming a constellation of deceit that was becoming impossible to ignore. The first and most obvious change was his phone. For years, his phone had been an open book, an extension of their shared life. He would leave it on the kitchen counter, and she would pick it up to add a grocery item to the shared list or check the weather. Now, it had become a black, silent fortress. It was never more than an arm's length away from him. It lay face down on his nightstand while he slept, a dark sentinel guarding its secrets. The audible pings of notifications had been silenced, but the screen would still flash to life in the darkened room, casting a fleeting, ghostly light on his face. One evening, as they sat on the sofa, ostensibly reading, she saw the screen illuminate from the corner of her eye. A banner preview appeared for a fraction of a second, but she saw the name before he angled the device away with a movement that was just a little too quick, a little too practiced. The name was Lila. Then there was the matter of his time. Caleb's calendar, once a shared Google Doc that governed the rhythm of their lives, had begun to sprout opaque, inviolable blocks of time. Private meeting. Strategy dinner. Investor call. They were always at odd hours, always last minute, and always impervious to her questions. A weekend trip to a hill country vineyard, planned for weeks to celebrate the end of her first trimester, was abruptly cancelled. An unavoidable emergency with the board, he had claimed, his eyes not quite meeting hers. He seemed genuinely apologetic, but the excuse felt thin, prefabricated. He spent that Saturday locked in his home office, and while he never left the penthouse, he was absent all the same, lost in a world she was no longer permitted to enter. Aris was a woman trained to find the truth in complex systems, and she began to apply that training to her own life. She did not stoop to checking his phone or hacking his email. Such a violation felt like a surrender, an admission that the trust was already dead. Instead, she turned to the public record. She began to read Lila Monroe's work, not as a casual observer, but as a forensic analyst. She devoured every article, every column, every interview the journalist had ever published about Aura intelligence. What she found was a subtle but undeniable narrative arc. The early pieces were sharp, objective, and occasionally critical. But beginning approximately 6 months ago, the tone had shifted. The reporting became softer, more laudatory. It was filled with exclusive quotes and insights that suggested an unparalleled level of access. Lila wasn't just reporting on Caleb anymore, she was curating his legend, polishing his myth. It read less like journalism and more like scripture. Aris created a private file on her laptop, a timeline. She cross-referenced the publication dates of Lila's most glowing articles with Caleb's calendar. The patterns were damning. The week Lila's profile of him as a modern emperor was published, Caleb had 3 late-night strategy dinners. A tech conference in San Francisco where Lila had been a keynote speaker coincided perfectly with a last-minute business trip Caleb had taken. Each new data point was another brick in the wall rising between them. The psychological toll was immense. The calm, confident woman who could command a lecture hall of graduate students was replaced by a specter of anxiety. She feigned sleep when Caleb came to bed late, her body rigid, listening to the sound of his breathing, wondering where he had been, who he had been with. She would catch her reflection in the mirror and see the dark circles under her eyes, the strain etched around her mouth. Was she becoming that person? The jealous, suspicious wife she had always pitied? The thought was terrifying. She was carrying their child, a being of pure hope and innocence, while her own heart was filling with a dark, corrosive poison. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. She was searching for the preliminary paperwork for their updated life insurance policy, a morbid but necessary task now that the baby was coming. She knew Caleb kept important family documents in his home office. The office itself was his sanctuary, a space of immaculate order. Stepping inside while he wasn't there felt like a transgression, but the paperwork was important. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books on his shelf, biographies of industrialists, tomes on quantum computing, histories of Rome. The insurance file wasn't there. She scanned the lower shelves, her eyes landing on a stack of art books he rarely touched. One of them was slightly askew. On impulse, driven by a nagging sense of wrongness, she pulled the heavy book from the shelf. Behind it, nestled in the dark recess, was a small, square box. It was covered in deep blue velvet, the kind that absorbs the light. It was from a designer jewelry store downtown, a place known for its modern, audacious pieces, a place she had never once expressed an interest in. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. For a moment, she just stared at it, her mind refusing to make the final leap. This could be anything. A gift for his mother. A corporate gift for a board member. But she knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was neither. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The velvet was soft and cool to the touch. With a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted the lid. There, resting on a bed of white satin, was a pair of diamond earrings. They were not her style. They were not classic studs or elegant drops. They were sharp, geometric, and aggressive, a constellation of tiny, brilliant-cut diamonds set in black titanium. They were the kind of jewelry a woman like Lila Monroe would wear. They were a statement. In that instant, the entire web of lies, the late nights, the secret calls, the canceled trips, the angled phone, all of it coalesced into this one, glittering, undeniable truth. This was not a suspicion. This was proof. The air rushed out of her lungs, and she had to grip the edge of the bookshelf to keep from falling. It wasn't about the monetary value of the gift. It was about the cold, calculated deceit. The planning, the purchase, the deliberate act of hiding it away in the heart of their home. The investigator in her had found the smoking gun. The wife in her had found the pieces of her broken heart. The abstract theory of his betrayal was now a physical reality, and its weight was crushing. The days that followed the discovery of the diamond earrings were a study in suspended animation. Aris Thorne moved through her life with the careful, deliberate motions of someone walking on a sheet of ice, terrified that a single misstep would send her plunging into the freezing water below. The velvet box sat in the back of her closet, hidden beneath a stack of old academic journals, a silent, ticking bomb in the heart of their home. She had not confronted Caleb. The words wouldn't form. What was there to say? To accuse him would be to detonate the bomb, to make the betrayal an irreversible, spoken fact that would shatter the fragile peace she was trying to maintain for the sake of their unborn child. And so, she existed in a cold, silent limbo, a ghost in her own life, haunted by the glittering proof of her husband's deceit. She went through the motions. She taught her seminars at the university, her voice a calm, academic drone that felt disconnected from the screaming chaos in her own mind. She attended prenatal appointments, smiling weakly at the ultrasound images of a tiny, fluttering heartbeat, a life so innocent of the wreckage it was about to be born into. She sat across the dinner table from Caleb, listening to him talk about market projections and software updates, and she would nod and ask the right questions, a perfect automaton of a supportive wife. The distance between them was no longer a crack, it was a chasm, and she was terrified to look into its depths. The question that consumed her was no longer if he was lying, but why? Was this a moment of weakness? A midlife crisis? Or was it something more, something deeper and more corrosive? The truth, when it arrived, did not come from a tearful confession or a private investigator's report. It came, as so much of the world's unfiltered truth now does, through an anonymous digital whisper. It arrived on a Thursday morning. Aris was in her university office, a small, cluttered space that felt more like home to her than the penthouse ever had. It was her sanctuary, a room filled with the comforting scent of old books and brewing coffee, a fortress of logic and reason against the emotional turmoil of her private life. She was attempting to focus on a research paper, but the words on the screen were just a meaningless jumble of letters. It was then that a new email notification appeared in the corner of her monitor. It was from a sender she didn't recognize, a string of nonsensical letters and numbers from an encrypted email service. There was no signature, no context. But the subject line consisted of a single, chilling word, truth. Her first instinct was to delete it. It was likely spam, or worse, a phishing attempt. But she hesitated. Her finger hovered over the trackpad. In her current state of heightened suspicion, nothing felt random. Everything felt like a signal, a clue. With a sense of grim inevitability, as if she were being compelled by a force outside of herself, she clicked it open. The body of the email was as stark as the subject line. It contained no text, only a single, downloadable audio file. The file was named Aura. A cold premonition washed over her. Her heart began the familiar, painful drumming against her ribs. This was it. The answer to the question she was too afraid to ask. She looked around her office, at the photos on her desk of her and Caleb in happier times, at the stacks of student papers waiting to be graded, at the mundane artifacts of a life that suddenly felt like a fiction. She slowly reached for her headphones, the professional-grade ones she used for transcribing interviews. She slipped them over her ears, the soft leather cup sealing her off from the world, creating an intimate, suffocating silence. Her hand was shaking as she moved the cursor over the file and clicked play. There was a brief hiss of static, then a man's voice, rough and impatient. "Are we secure?" he grunted. Aris didn't recognize the voice. Then, a second voice, a woman's, joined in. It was a voice Aris had heard only once before, in a television interview, but it was instantly, sickeningly recognizable. It was the calm, confident alto of Lila Monroe. "As secure as it gets," Lila said, a hint of amusement in her tone. "Relax, Elias. You sound nervous." Elias. The name hit Aris like a physical blow. Elias Sterling. The CEO of Sterling Dynamics, Aura's largest and most predatory competitor. Caleb's sworn corporate enemy. What in God's name was Lila Monroe doing talking to him? "I'm not nervous, I'm impatient," Sterling growled. "Is he fully compromised yet? We're approaching the launch window for Phase 2, and I need to know he's not going to get cold feet." "He's a puppy dog, Elias," Lila said, and Aris could almost hear the dismissive wave of her hand. "He thinks our late-night calls are about his vision. He's feeding me internal data, product timelines, even personnel vulnerabilities, and he thinks he's just unburdening himself to the only person who truly understands him. The ego on that man is a security flaw the size of the Grand Canyon." Aris felt the blood drain from her face. Internal data. Personnel vulnerabilities. This wasn't a conversation between two people discussing an affair. This was a debriefing between a spy and her handler. "What about the wife?" Sterling pressed. "The sainted Dr. Thorne. Is she a problem?" "The wife is the key," Lila replied coolly. "She's his moral compass, his anchor. He's terrified of losing her. That's our leverage. Once we go public, the scandal will paralyze him. The board will panic, the stock will tank, and he'll be too busy trying to save his marriage to effectively fight off your acquisition offer. He'll be so grateful to you for saving his company that he'll practically hand you the keys. It's the perfect play." Aris ripped the headphones from her ears, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The silence of her office rushed back in, but it was a different kind of silence now, heavy and menacing. She stared at the computer screen, at the paused audio file, her mind struggling to process the sheer, layered complexity of the betrayal. It was an Escher painting of deceit. The affair wasn't the story. The affair was just the weapon. Her heartbreak, the pain that had consumed her for weeks, was not the main event, it was merely collateral damage, a calculated and necessary casualty in a ruthless corporate war. Her perception of Caleb shifted with dizzying speed. The image of the flawed, unfaithful husband was obliterated, replaced by something far more pathetic, a fool. A pawn. A man so blinded by his own ego and insecurity that he had allowed the enemy to walk right through the front gates of his empire, and he had handed her the keys himself. The rage that had been simmering beneath her grief now erupted, a white-hot, clarifying fury. Her pain was no longer just personal, it was strategic. She had been used, her marriage weaponized, her future child's legacy put at risk, all for the sake of a hostile takeover. Just as her mind began to race, piecing together the timeline, a news alert popped up on her screen from a major media outlet. The headline was a gut punch, exclusive, journalist Lila Monroe to sit down for tell-all interview. The truth about Silicon Hills billion-dollar man. The interview was scheduled for the following night. The ticking bomb was no longer in her closet. It was about to be detonated on national television in front of millions of people. Lila, sensing that Caleb was perhaps becoming hesitant or that the timing was right, was seizing control of the narrative. She was launching the public phase of the attack. Aris leaned back in her chair, the fury inside her crystallizing into a cold, hard resolve. They had all underestimated her. Elias Sterling saw her as a leverage point. Lila Monroe saw her as a key to her husband's downfall. Even Caleb, in his own way, had seen her as a moral ideal to be placated while he indulged his darker appetites. None of them had seen her for what she truly was, a strategist, a survivor, and now, the sole keeper of the one piece of evidence that could burn their entire play to the ground. The game had been revealed to her, and she was no longer just a pawn on the board. The 24 hours leading up to Lila Monroe's television interview were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The media world was in a frenzy, with cable news channels running teasers and online outlets publishing speculative clickbait articles. The upcoming interview was no longer just a story, it was an event, a public spectacle promising the immolation of a king. Inside the glass tower of Aura Intelligence, and within the colder walls of the penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating dread. Caleb Vance was a man unraveling. He paced his office like a caged animal, barking orders at a shell-shocked team of public relations experts and lawyers. They were attempting to fight a war, but they had no intelligence, no idea what bombshells were about to be deployed. Caleb was flying blind into the heart of a hurricane, and the panic rolling off him was palpable. Aris, in stark contrast, was a picture of unnerving calm. The fury and shock from the audio recording had cooled, settling deep within her into something hard and clear, like a diamond formed under immense pressure. She had not slept, but her mind was sharp, analytical. She observed Caleb's frantic preparations from a detached distance, watching him try to build a fortress against a flood whose true source only she understood. He made a few desperate, pleading calls to her, his voice strained and thin, but she let them go to voicemail. She could not offer comfort, and she would not offer a warning. He had chosen to walk into this storm alone, he would face its opening salvo the same way. She was no longer a participant in his emotional chaos. She was an observer, a strategist, waiting for the precise moment to make her move on the board. When the interview began, Aris was sitting alone in the dark of their home theater, the massive screen her only light source. She had a glass of water, a legal pad, and a pen. She was not watching as a wife, she was watching as an intelligence analyst gathering data on an enemy combatant. Lila Monroe appeared on screen, and Aris had to give her a moment of cold, professional respect. She was a masterful performer. She was dressed not in the sharp, aggressive attire of a journalist, but in a soft, cream-colored cashmere sweater. Her makeup was minimal, her hair styled to look natural and uncontrived. She looked vulnerable, thoughtful, and deeply wounded. It was a perfectly calibrated costume designed to elicit maximum sympathy. The interview began, and Lila wove her narrative with the skill of a master novelist. She never raised her voice. She would pause, as if searching for the right words, letting a tear glisten in her eye before bravely blinking it back. She admitted to the affair, but she framed it not as a tawdry fling, but as a profound, tragic meeting of souls. Caleb, she said, her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity, is a brilliant man, but he is also a profoundly lonely one. I think I saw the man behind the myth, and I fell in love with that man. She painted Aris not as a villain, but as a tragically mismatched partner, a brilliant academic who could never understand the crushing pressures of the world Caleb inhabited. She was, in her telling, not a homewrecker, but a soulmate. Then, with the audience firmly on her side, she began to deploy her weapons. The host would ask a question about Aura, and Lila would feign reluctance. "Oh, I don't think it's my place to talk about the business," she would say, before proceeding to do exactly that, couching corporate assassination in the language of concern. "I just worry about him," she sighed, shaking her head sadly. "He puts on such a brave face, but I know how much pressure he's under. That new product line, the Odyssey project. I know they've had some significant delays with the core processor. He was so worried about what it would mean for the third quarter projections." To the average viewer, it sounded like the intimate concern of a lover. To Wall Street, it was a tactical leak of devastating inside information. She continued, a surgeon with a poisoned scalpel. She spoke of his concerns about retaining top engineering talent, subtly hinting at internal strife. She mentioned his desperate search for a new round of private funding, painting a picture of a company not on the cusp of a breakthrough, but on the edge of a financial precipice. Every word was a half-truth, a distortion, a piece of proprietary information wrapped in the guise of a lover's confidence. By the time the interview ended, Lila Monroe had successfully recast herself as the tragic heroine of the story, and she had slit the throat of Aura Intelligence on national television without shedding a drop of blood. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. In the pre-market trading hours that followed, Aura's stock futures plummeted by 30%. Business news channels, which had been treating the story as a gossip item, now reframed it as a major corporate crisis. Pundits questioned Caleb's leadership, his stability, his judgment. The narrative was set: the brilliant CEO, distracted by a messy affair, had let his empire crumble. At precisely 9:30 a.m., when the New York Stock Exchange opened, the trap was sprung. A news alert lit up every screen in the financial world. Sterling Dynamics had formally announced an all-cash, hostile takeover bid for Aura Intelligence. In his public statement, Elias Sterling presented himself as a reluctant savior, offering to restore stability and protect shareholder value at a company that had clearly lost its way. While Caleb's world was imploding, Aris was in her university office, the one place she felt truly in control. The interview had been even more damning than she'd anticipated. The audio file on her laptop felt like the most powerful weapon in the world. Her first instinct was pure, unadulterated revenge, to release it to the biggest gossip website she could find and watch them all burn. But the strategist in her took over. A chaotic, uncontrolled release would only add to the noise. It might even be dismissed as a fake, a desperate tactic from a scorned wife. She needed to be precise. She needed to strike with the force of an undeniable, corroborated truth. She opted for a two-pronged attack. First, she addressed the internal crisis. She identified the lead independent director on Aura's board, a formidable former federal judge named Eleanor Vance, no relation, known for her unimpeachable integrity. From an anonymous, encrypted email account, Aris sent a single message to Judge Vance's private email address. The subject was "for the good of the company." The body contained the audio file and a single sentence: "This is the truth behind tonight's acquisition offer." This would neutralize the board, preventing them from panicking and accepting Sterling's predatory bid. Second, she addressed the public narrative. She bypassed the sensationalist media outlets and sent the same package to a veteran investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, a man renowned for his deep, methodical reporting on corporate malfeasance. Her message to him was equally brief: the real story isn't the affair. It's the crime. Listen to this. She hit send on both emails and then shut her laptop. There was nothing more to do but wait. She didn't have to wait long. Within 2 hours, the story broke, but it was a new story, an earthquake that completely reordered the landscape. The Wall Street Journal published a bombshell report, its headline wiping every other news item off the map: "Leaked audio implicates Sterling Dynamics CEO in corporate espionage plot to manipulate market and force hostile takeover of rival Aura Intelligence." The article was a devastating, forensic takedown of the entire scheme. It featured transcribed excerpts from the recording, expert analysis of the market manipulation, and a timeline that perfectly aligned Lila's leaks with Sterling's pre-planned offer. The narrative didn't just shift, it was completely inverted. Caleb Vance was no longer the villain, he was the target. Lila Monroe was not a tragic lover, she was a corporate spy. Elias Sterling was not a savior, he was a criminal. The media storm turned into a firestorm, but now it was consuming its creators. Sterling Dynamics stock crashed. The SEC and the FBI both announced formal investigations into market manipulation and corporate espionage. Elias Sterling was fired by his own board before the end of the day. And Lila Monroe? She vanished. Her social media was deleted, her phone disconnected. She became a digital ghost, her reputation and career incinerated in the blaze she herself had started. The immediate threat was over. The corporate fortress, though damaged, had been saved. But as the smoke cleared, Aris Thorne sat in the quiet of her office, knowing that the external war was won, but the civil war, the one that had to be fought within the walls of her own home and her own heart, was only just beginning. In the annals of corporate warfare, the swift and brutal implosion of Elias Sterling's espionage plot became a legendary case study. The media, having feasted on the story of Caleb Vance's infidelity, now turned with even greater ferocity on the tale of Sterling's treachery. He became the new villain, a modern-day Iago whose ambition had curdled into criminality. His name was disgraced, his company was in freefall, and he faced a barrage of legal battles that would consume the remainder of his career. Lila Monroe, the architect of the public-facing assault, had vanished completely, her name now a byword for journalistic malfeasance. The storm had passed. The enemy had been vanquished. From a purely strategic standpoint, Caleb Vance had won. His company was secure, his board was loyal, and his reputation, though bruised, had been reframed from that of a philanderer to that of a victim. But inside the silent, climate-controlled air of the penthouse overlooking the Colorado River, there were no victors. There were only survivors, adrift in the wreckage. The empire of Aura Intelligence had been saved from external forces, but the private empire, the one built on vows and shared dreams between a husband and a wife, had been burned to the ground. All that remained was the quiet, lingering smell of smoke and the cold, gray ash of broken trust. For 2 days after the public vindication, they did not speak of it. A fragile, unspoken truce held the space between them. They moved through the vast, empty rooms like strangers, their paths occasionally crossing in the kitchen or the hallway, a quick murmur of "excuse me" the only sound to break the oppressive silence. Caleb was a ghost of the man who had stood on the gala stage. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes. He seemed smaller, diminished, a king deposed not by his enemies, but by his own catastrophic folly. He made her coffee in the morning, leaving the mug on the counter for her to find. He would ask if she needed anything from the store. They were the small, mundane gestures of a shared life, but they were now imbued with the desperate, pathetic weight of a man trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. Aris, for her part, had retreated into a state of profound emotional exhaustion. The cold, hard resolve that had carried her through the crisis had melted away, leaving a deep, bone-wearying fatigue. She had saved the company, but the act had taken everything from her. She felt no triumph, only a vast, empty sadness. She had proven herself to be a brilliant strategist, but she had been forced to use those skills to dissect the ruins of her own heart. She spent her time in the nursery they had designed together, her room painted a soft, hopeful shade of yellow. She would sit in the rocking chair, her hand resting on her stomach, feeling the gentle kicks of the life within her. This room, this child, was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that had not been contaminated by the web of lies. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not a storm, but a quiet, creeping fog. It was a Saturday afternoon. Aris was in the living room, staring out at the Austin skyline, when Caleb entered the room. He didn't speak at first, just stood a few feet away, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, it was Aris who broke it. Her voice was not angry, not accusatory. It was quiet, weary, the voice of a researcher stating an observed fact. "You never would have told me." Caleb flinched, as if she had struck him. He slowly shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I think I was going to. After the funding round closed. I wanted to." "You wanted to what?" Aris interrupted, her voice still unnervingly calm. "Manage the fallout? Contain the damage? Was I a problem to be managed, Caleb?" "No," he said, finally looking at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading anguish. "No, Aris, never. You are everything. I was stupid. I was weak, and I was so incredibly stupid." This was the opening he had rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times, the confession, the self-flagellation, the plea for forgiveness. But Aris was no longer interested in the mechanics of the affair. That was just the symptom. She needed to understand the disease. "I don't care about the stupidity, Caleb," she said, turning from the window to face him fully. "I need to understand the why. Not why you slept with her. I need to understand why you let her in. Why you needed what she was offering. What was so broken in us, in you, that you had to go looking for, whatever it was? He had no easy answer. He stammered, trying to explain the pressure, the loneliness, the way Lila had seemed to understand the part of him that was the CEO, the emperor, the myth. He spoke of his own insecurities, the fear that he was an imposter, the history teacher's son who had stumbled into a world he didn't deserve. He tried to explain that it had nothing to do with Aris, that his love for her was a separate, sacred thing. As she listened, Aris felt a profound, soul-crushing pity. It was worse than anger. She saw him for what he was, not a monster, but a man so consumed by his own narrative that he had become blind to the truth. He had built an empire, but he had never truly believed he was worthy of it. Lila Monroe hadn't seduced him with sex, she had seduced him with validation. She had held up a mirror that reflected the image of the man he desperately wanted to be, and he had fallen in love with the reflection. "So you gave her the keys to our life," Aris said, her voice flat. "You gave a stranger the power to destroy everything we have built, all because she told you what you wanted to hear. Because she flattered the part of your ego that I refused to indulge. Is that it?" Tears were now streaming down Caleb's face. He nodded, a single, broken gesture of assent. "Yes," he choked out. "I know. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, Aris. If you'll let me. For the baby. For us. We can rebuild. I know we can." Aris looked at him, at the man she had loved, the father of her child, and she saw the fatal flaw in his logic. He was a builder. He believed anything, once broken, could be fixed, re-engineered, made stronger. But he didn't understand that trust is not a structure of steel and glass. It's a living thing. And once it has been killed, it does not come back to life. "You saved the company, Aris," he whispered, taking a hesitant step toward her. "You saved me. Doesn't that mean something?" "I didn't do it for you," she replied, and the cold finality in her voice made him freeze. "And I didn't do it for the company. I did it for this child. I did it because I will not have my son or daughter born into the ruins of another man's greed. I protected our child's legacy. Not yours." She stood up then, walking past and towards the nursery. She paused at the door, her back to him. "I don't know what happens now, Caleb. I don't know if us even exists anymore. The only thing I know is that in 3 months, I am going to be a mother. And you are going to be a father. That is the only fact that matters. We will have to find a way to honor that fact. The rest is just ashes." She walked into the nursery and gently closed the door, leaving him alone in the cavernous living room, the sole emperor of a silent, broken kingdom. The story of Caleb Vance and Aris Thorne serves as a chilling postscript to the gospel of ambition. It is a reminder that the most formidable empires are not brought down by rival armies or hostile takeovers, but by the quiet corrosion of internal decay. It poses a question that lingers long after the headlines have faded: can a foundation, once shattered by deceit, ever truly be rebuilt? Or are we destined to live among the ruins, forever haunted by the ghosts of what might have been?